Wisconsin, 1994. A farmer's field in Kenosha County. The soil is heavy clay, and buried in it are the ribs of a mammoth. Nothing strange yet. Mammoths died all over this land. But then someone lifts a stone from beside the bones, and it is not a stone. It's a tool, chipped, shaped, made by a hand. And the bones around it are cut, scraped, pulled apart the way you butcher an animal for meat. That should be routine, except when the lab dates it, the number lands centuries before the first Americans were supposed to exist. And that is the problem. Let me show you the object first, because the object is the whole fight. The animal is called the Hebior mammoth. It was pulled from the ground near Kenosha by an archaeologist named David Overstreet, and about 85% of the skeleton came out of that clay, not scattered, not gnawed apart by predators, disarticulated in a pattern that looks like work. And lying with those bones were chipped stone artifacts, a biface, a chopper-like tool, the kind of things a person makes on purpose and carries for a reason. A tool does not fall out of the sky. Somebody flaked it, somebody held it, somebody stood over this dead mammoth with that stone in their hand and took the animal apart. The tool outlived the hand that made it. That's what you're looking at. For most of the 20th century, there was one answer to the question of who got here first, and the answer had a name. Clovis, named for the beautiful fluted spear points first found near Clovis, New Mexico. The story was clean. Around 13,000 years ago, hunters crossed from Siberia, walked south through a corridor that opened between melting ice sheets, and spread across two empty continents. Before Clovis, nothing. An empty hemisphere waiting for a door to open. Clovis, first, wasn't a fringe idea. It was the textbook. It was the default. For decades, if you claimed to have found humans in the Americas before Clovis, the burden of proof landed on you like a collapsing wall. Now, put the Wisconsin mammoth back in that world. The radiocarbon dates on the Hebior, and a second nearby mammoth, the Schaefer, came back around 12,300 to 12,500 radiocarbon years. Calibrate that to calendar years, and you're standing near 14,500 years ago. More than 1,000 years before the corridor was supposed to let anyone through. Before Clovis, before the front door of the accepted story had opened. The date was the problem. Not the tool, not the cut marks, the date. And here's the detail that should bother you. The mammoth is doing the testifying. There's no human skeleton here. But you don't need one. You have an animal that was butchered by someone, and stone tools that someone made, sealed in a layer that says it happened too early. The witness isn't a person, it's the prey. So what happens when a discovery like this lands in a field that already knows the answer? It doesn't get burned. It doesn't get locked in a vault. Something quieter happens. It gets set aside. Cited carefully, if at all. Filed under interesting, but the safer bet, always, was that something must be wrong with the site. Maybe the dates drifted. Maybe those stones weren't really tools. Maybe the marks weren't really butchery. Not accusations, exactly. Just doubt applied steadily until the discovery stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like a footnote. Overstreet spent years standing behind those mammoths. And this is the part people miss about how evidence gets buried. Nobody needs a conspiracy. You don't need a secret meeting. You just need a field that already knows the shape of the past, and a discovery that doesn't fit that shape. The easiest way to shelve something inconvenient is not to destroy it. It's to make the person carrying it look like they got out over their skis. But here's the thing about a single strange site. You can isolate it. One farm in Wisconsin, one odd date, one stubborn archaeologist. Contain it and the map stays intact. Overstreet was not alone, because at almost the same time, on the other end of the hemisphere, in a cold bog in southern Chile, the exact same fight was already tearing the field apart. And that one couldn't be filed under interesting, but the site is called Monte Verde. An archaeologist named Tom Dillahay had been excavating it since the late 1970s, and what the bog preserved was almost unfair. Peat sealed the site like a wet lid. Wood survived. Plant remains survived. Pieces of preserved animal tissue survived. Chunks of what looked like the frame of a hut. This wasn't a handful of ambiguous stones. This was a soggy, waterlogged snapshot of people living their lives. And the dates came back around 14,500 years ago. The same window as the Wisconsin mammoths. 2 sites, 2 hemispheres, 1 impossible number. Now you don't have an anomaly, you have a twin. The reaction was not curiosity, it was war. Monte Verde was accused of everything a site can be accused of. Disturbed layers, misread material, dates that couldn't be trusted. Some of the loudest voices in American archaeology treated the whole thing as a mistake that just needed exposing. Because if Monte Verde was real, the corridor story was dead, and a lot of careers had been built on the corridor being the only road. So how do you settle a fight like that? You'd think it would be data. More dates, more papers. It wasn't. It was mud on their boots. In 1997, a group of the field's heaviest hitters, including some who had spent their careers defending the Clovis wall, flew to Chile and walked the site themselves. They stood in the bog. They looked at the layers, they examined the material with their own hands, and then, one by one, they signed off. Monte Verde was real, pre-Clovis was real. That should have been the earthquake, the public reckoning, the moment the textbooks tore themselves up. It wasn't. There was no loud apology, no dramatic reversal on the evening news. A consensus that had held for half a century cracked, and the field mostly just moved on, quietly. Which raises an ugly little question. If Monte Verde could win a jury of skeptics in a Chilean bog, why did those Wisconsin mammoths with the same dates stay stuck on the margins? Because winning one battle is not the same as changing the map. And there was a second kind of site that was even harder to argue with, the kind where the layers stack up like pages in a book. That site is a rock shelter in Pennsylvania called Meadow Croft. And the man who dug it, James Adovasio, spent decades in a fight that makes the others look gentle. Meadowcroft isn't a single suspicious layer, it's a deep sequence. Occupation on top of occupation, going down and down, each one older than the last, laid out in clean stratigraphy that reads like a calendar. And the deepest human layers pushed back towards 16,000 years, maybe more. Older than Monte Verde, older than the mammoths. You can't easily wave away a wall of stacked layers. So the objection changed shape. The attack on Meadowcroft was contamination. Specifically, the idea that ancient carbon, coal, or dissolved old carbon in the groundwater had seeped into the samples and made the radiocarbon dates look older than they really were. It's a real phenomenon. It genuinely can throw dates off. On paper, it's a serious scientific objection, and that is exactly what made it so effective. Adovasio spent years testing for it, arguing against it, documenting the sediments, defending the wall. Same layers, same dates, tested again, same answer. And still the contamination question hung over the site like a stain that wouldn't wash out, because you can't fully disprove a maybe. That's the trap. The date might be contaminated is almost impossible to kill. You can pile up evidence against it forever and the word just sits there, doing its job. Watch what that one word did to a whole field. Contamination became the master key. Almost any early date, anywhere, could be turned off with it. Sample too old? Must be old carbon. Layer too deep? Must have been disturbed. You didn't have to prove the discovery was wrong. You just had to raise the possibility that it might be, and let the burden of proof do the rest. And here's the honest, uncomfortable part. Sometimes the critics were right. Some early sites really were contaminated. Some stones really weren't tools. The skeptics were not villains, inventing objections out of thin air. But the standard wasn't applied evenly. Evidence that fit the Clovis model got a pass. Evidence that broke it got the full interrogation. Same science, two different levels of suspicion, depending entirely on whether the answer was allowed to be true. So the question becomes obvious. Is there any evidence that contamination can't touch? Something that isn't a fragile radiocarbon date on a scrap of charcoal? There is. And it comes in two forms that hit from completely different directions. The first is in Oregon, at a place called the Paisley Caves. Researchers there weren't just dating charcoal. They found human coprolites and pulled ancient human DNA straight out of them, dated to around 14,000 years and older. You can argue about a lot of things. It's much harder to argue that human DNA in a dated layer belongs to nobody. The second is in Virginia, at a site called Cactus Hill, sitting in ordinary sand dunes. Below the Clovis layer, physically underneath it, were older tools. And they weren't Clovis style, different technology, a different way of working stone, which means whoever made them wasn't a slightly earlier Clovis hunter. They were somebody else, somebody who was already here before Clovis existed, using their own toolkit. Go back to those Wisconsin mammoths now. In isolation, easy to dismiss. Standing beside a Chilean bog, a Pennsylvania rock shelter, DNA in an Oregon cave, and a separate stone tradition buried under Clovis in Virginia. The cut marks stopped looking like an accident. The pattern is the argument. And notice what the fight had quietly become. It was no longer about defending one date. The old model was now defending a shape, the idea of a single people, arriving through a single door at a single moment. Every new site was another crack in that shape. But all of this, the tools, the DNA, the stacked layers, still lives in the world of specialists. Coprolites and stratigraphy don't grab a normal person by the collar. And then the debate produced something that did, something you don't need a degree to understand, a footprint. At White Sands, in New Mexico, in the cracked white floor of an ancient, dried lake bed, researchers found human footprints. Not tools someone left behind, not a date on a bone, the actual shape of a foot pressed into old mud, walking. Children's prints, adults, a person crossing wet ground one step after another, frozen in the sediment. And when the seeds in those footprint layers were dated, the number came back somewhere around 21 to 23,000 years ago. Stop and feel that. Not 14,000, not 16, more than 20,000 years. That's not before the corridor opened. That's during the last ice age, at its coldest, deep inside a period when the accepted story said the Americas were sealed off and empty. A footprint is a person physically standing where the model says nobody could have been. The pushback came fast, and it was the old weapon in a new coat. The seeds used for dating came from an aquatic plant, and aquatic plants can absorb old carbon from the water, the reservoir effect, which could, in theory, make the dates look thousands of years too old. There it is again. Contamination, the maybe that never dies. Except this time the story didn't end there. The team went back and dated the footprint layers a different way. Radiocarbon on pollen from land plants, which don't have the old water problem, and separately, optically stimulated luminescence on quartz grains, a method that dates the sediment itself, not anything that could have absorbed bad carbon. Different materials, different clocks, independent methods. Same answer. Around 21 to 23,000 years. Watch what just happened. The objection that had worked for decades, the objection that sank sites, ended arguments, protected the model, was thrown at White Sands, and this time it bounced off. Repeated testing didn't strengthen the doubt. It weakened it. The critics' best weapon got turned around and pointed the other way. The footprints are still debated. This is not fully settled, and honest people can still argue about it, but it is a very different kind of debate than it used to be, because now the burden is shifting onto the people who want the prints to be young. And if humans were on this landscape more than 20,000 years ago, one question swallows all the others. How far back does this actually go? Is there a floor to it at all? Which brings us to the edge of the map, the claim so extreme that most researchers refuse it outright, and they may well be right to. In San Diego, back in the 1990s, a road crew uncovered the bones of a mastodon. It sat, like so much of this story, in a museum for years. Then a team, including researchers named Steve and Kathleen Holan, took another look, and in 2017 they published something in Nature that detonated. They argued the mastodon bones had been deliberately smashed by humans using stones, heavy cobbles they identified as hammerstones, and an anvil to get at the marrow. And the date they put on it was not 14,000 years, not 20,000, 130,000 years. Let me be completely straight with you. Almost no one accepts this. The mainstream response was immediate and hard, and the objections are strong. 130,000 years ago, the only humans anywhere near this capability were in the Old World. There are no other sites remotely that old in the Americas, no tools, no camps, no bones, nothing. And critics argue the bones could have been broken by natural forces, heavy machinery from the road construction, geological pressure, weight over time. Broken bone is not the same as butchery. So why bring it up at all if it's almost certainly wrong? Because of what it reveals about the shape of the argument, not the truth of the claim, the geometry of it. For 50 years, the debate had a comfortable ceiling, 13,000 years and no higher. Clovis was the roof. Once the mammoths, the bog, the footprints, and the DNA tore that roof off, the ceiling was gone. And when there's no ceiling, someone will always test how high the room actually goes. Cerruti is almost certainly the room's collapse, not its height. But the fact that a serious team could publish it in a serious journal tells you the old confidence was already gone. You don't get a 100,000-year claim in a world that's sure about 13,000. Now step back from the individual sites and look at the real problem underneath all of them. If people were here this early, even at the cautious end, even at 20,000 years, how did they get here? And why is the evidence so thin, so scattered, so easy to attack one site at a time? The answer might be that we've been looking in the wrong place, on land. For decades, the assumption was that the first Americans walked down the ice-free corridor on foot, following the game, but that corridor may have opened too late and been too barren too early on to actually feed a migration, which points at a different road entirely. The coast. The idea is sometimes called the Kelp Highway. The archaeologist John Erlandson is one of its central voices. Picture a rich Pacific coastline during the Ice Age, kelp forests, shellfish, seals, seabirds, a moving buffet running all the way down from Asia to South America. People with boats could have hopped along that edge, coast to coast, long before any inland corridor was passable. It explains the speed. It explains how you get people to southern Chile so fast. It explains why a boat beats a walk, but it comes with a brutal catch. At the height of the Ice Age, so much water was locked in ice that the sea level was far lower than today. The coastline those people would have walked, camped on, and launched their boats from is now drowned. Underwater. Hundreds of feet down, out on the continental shelf, buried under sand and ocean. Think about what that means. For 50 years, inland archaeologists looked for the first Americans on dry land and mostly found silence, and treated that silence as proof of an empty continent. But the main road may never have been on land at all. The evidence didn't vanish. It's under the sea. We built a story around the empty spots on the map without asking whether the map was missing its most important coastline. A bridge drowned after the footprints on the far shore were already there. And there's one more thread that finishes off the clean version for good. The DNA. The old story was one people, one wave, one door. Genetics has taken that story apart. There's a Clovis-era child from Montana known as Anzic 1, whose genome ties into populations across the Americas. There are the ancient Beringians, a group who split off and revealed that the peopling of this hemisphere was structured, layered more than a single pulse. And most unsettling of all, there's a strange, contested genetic signal in some Amazonian populations that seems to point toward Australasia, toward the other side of the planet. It's disputed, it's not understood, but it's there in the data, hinting at a connection nobody's model has room for. The single arrow on the migration map was the real fiction all along. So let's go back to Wisconsin, back to that heavy clay in Kenosha County, back to the heavy ore mammoth. Today, that skeleton stands mounted in a museum, and near it sit the stone tools that came out of the ground with it. Behind glass. Quiet. A butchered animal, and the tools that butchered it, roughly 14,500 years old, from a time when the textbook said no one was here to hold a knife. When Overstreet first defended those mammoths, he was out on a limb, an outlier defending an inconvenient date. He isn't anymore. Not because there was some grand vindication, a headline, a reversal announced from a podium. There wasn't. That's not how it happened. Here's what's verified. The tools are real. The cut marks are real. The dates are solid, and they land before Clovis. That much is not seriously in question anymore. Here's what's still fought over. The exact routes, the precise ages of some sites, whether those White Sands prints are 23,000 years old or somewhat younger, and the Kurudi Mastodon, which most researchers still put firmly in the no column. And here's what we honestly cannot know yet. Who these people were, how many waves came, what the drowned coastline is still holding a few hundred feet underwater, where almost no one has dug. But the biggest change isn't in any one of those answers. It's in what happened to Clovis first. It didn't collapse in public. Nobody stood up and admitted the field had spent 50 years guarding the wrong wall. It just faded. The certainty drained out of the textbooks. The bold sentences turned into careful ones. The maps grew new arrows and dotted lines. The museum labels got quieter. The old model didn't apologize. It just changed clothes. And that mammoth still stands there behind the glass with the tools that took it apart, patient, holding the date that was once too dangerous to say out loud, while somewhere off the coast, under a few hundred feet of cold water, the road those people actually walked is still down there in the dark, waiting for someone willing to go look.